what America can do for women, but what women can do for America.
Let's talk about when Geraldine Farrar won the Democratic nomination in '84. That convention had a lot of problems. One of them was Walter Mondale saying he's going to raise taxes.
Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did.
His chances probably ended just about there. Now, he was running against an extraordinarily gifted presidential candidate in Ronald Reagan in California. And also, you'll remember that the party, as it almost always on the Democratic side, was divided by some rules. Jesse Jackson was making a run of things out there. And it was also in San Francisco. We all had a good time there. I remember, I think maybe it's the first time I met you.
Well, I liked it because of the time zone difference, because you could actually have fun after the convention was over every night.
We'd all repair to a place called the Washington Square Bar and Grill, known affectionately as the Wash Bag. Walter Cronkite would have one table, Ben Bradley would have another table, Bob Strauss would have another table, and people would be on the outside looking in saying, Bob Strauss just ordered that 68 Mondavi Cabernet. Look at that. And so there was kind of a play-by-play.
Marty Expense account's great. Let's talk about the wonderful speech given at that '84 convention by Mario Cuomo.
In many ways, we are a shining city on a hill. But the hard truth is that not everyone is sharing in this city's splendor and glory. A shining city is perhaps all the president sees from the portico of the White House and the veranda of his ranch, where everyone seems to be doing well.
Do you think that had any positive impact except for inspiring the faithful?
Did it bring people across the line? Well, not if you look at the election results, it didn't. But it did. I think what it did was put in play the social issues that the Democrats always wanted to talk about, and he did it so much better than Walter Mondale could have.
Let's talk about a president who didn't have quite that gift. That's George Bush Sr., the first President Bush. Tell me what you thought of that acceptance speech down at New Orleans back in '88.
Well, I thought it was a very good acceptance speech. He'd prepared for it. He was never completely at ease in his own skin when he was before a big crowd. But that night he was primed, and then he uttered what turned out to be the fatal phrase.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
He did win not just the hall, but I think that the country saw him in a new light. He was no longer just in the shadow of Ronald Reagan. He'd claimed his own place.
My choice for the vice presidency is Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana.
Some people feel that Dan Quayle's debut in New Orleans at that '88 convention was disastrous for him in the long run.
That's when he showed up with the riverboat. And
what was wrong with that picture as he was projecting himself that day?
Well, because he didn't seem mature. You know, people didn't know him very well as his real introduction to the country. His real introduction, frankly, to the political pros had been around, because he was a backbencher in the United States Senate. He'd gotten close to George Bush, and suddenly he was like a college sophomore who had just been elected to the student council in some fashion.
So he was better off if he'd stayed in the Senate for the last 20 years.
That's right. And then the next stop he makes is at my booth and other booths talking about his National Guard experience, and he was not very clear about that.
I don't know the specifics of that. The only thing I know is I did want to get into the National Guard.
Why didn't that hurt more?
Because I think that the greater liability was who he was running against. I think that Michael Dukakis ran a terrible campaign. I think that's why it didn't hurt more.
Let's talk about the very interesting 1988 Democratic Convention and what I remember to be a very hot Atlanta, Georgia. Remember a couple of things. First of all, it was Bill Clinton's debut on the national stage.
Bill Clinton pressing on with his nominating speech, which has now been running for about 25 minutes altogether, and he's only about 3/4 of the way through. He has a restless crowd on his hands, but he has much more that he wants to say.
One of the worst speeches given in the convention, he was nominating Michael Dukakis, and he got up there, and he droned on and droned on and droned on, and when he said, in conclusion, people began to cheer. And I saw him the next day, and he started toward me, and I literally kind of slipped out of the way. I didn't know what to say to him.
You're afraid to say, how'd I do?
Well, he knew at that point how he had done. He was making the rounds. He went on Johnny Carson.
He went on Carson, yeah.
And that should have told you something about Bill Clinton at that point. You know, he would make the big mistake, but then he would crawl out of it in his own endearing fashion.
Hence the nickname.
Yes, that's right.
The comeback kid. Let me ask you about Jesse Jackson, because not everybody who gives a good speech gets the nomination.
His four parents came to America on immigrant ships. My four parents came to America on slave ships. But whatever the original ships, we're in the same boat tonight.
Here's a little insight into what was going on in '88. Jackson made a great speech before the convention, had his family arrayed before him. But I had seen him earlier that day, and he was in a cold rage because of the way he had been treated by Michael Dukakis. He didn't think he was taken seriously by Dukakis as a prospective running mate and as a power within the party.
What did you make of Ann Richards' speech at that convention?
Poor George. He can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth.
Well, everyone was amused by it, and it was red meat for the delegates on the floor. But in retrospect, it probably helped George Bush because it seemed mean-spirited. You know, Ann's got a great style about her. It's all Texas, that silver hair and all that. But when she said he was born with a silver foot in his mouth, you know, he landed on third base and thought he'd hit a triple, that seemed mean. And the country is not mean-spirited when it comes to its politics. I think it's one of the dilemmas that we have now.
Love, marriage, and politics. When we return, some memorable moments starring the wives of the candidates.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my husband, our next president of the United States, Al Gore.